My parents refused to pay for my college, insisting I be independent, but they fully funded my sister's education. Feeling betrayed, I decided to walk away. But now, after a heated family dispute, my father is reaching out, asking me to come back. When I turned 18, my parents told me it was time to stand on my own 2 feet. As I was gearing up to start college, they sat me down for a talk about the importance of independence and the value of money. They made it clear that I would need to fund my own college education and manage life on my own. While they assured me they'd offer occasional support if I really needed it, the message was clear. They wanted me to navigate life independently. In other words, the moment I became an adult, they pretty much nudged me out the door. This came as a bit of a surprise because we had always had a decent relationship. But I didn't argue. I figured it was time for me to learn how to manage on my own. So I accepted their terms and began planning how to finance my college education. Fortunately, I had saved up a bit of money from various part-time jobs over the years, so I wasn't too worried. After being accepted into my chosen college, I decided to work while studying to cover my tuition and other expenses. For the past 2 years, that's exactly what I've been doing. It's been tough. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Juggling classes and work has been exhausting, and I don't earn much, so I live on a tight budget. There are days when I feel completely overwhelmed. Occasionally, I've asked my parents for help with smaller everyday expenses, and they've stepped in, but I try to avoid it as much as possible. After all, they were the ones who stressed the importance of independence when I turned 18. But recently I learned something that made me question whether they really believed in the importance of independence, or if it was just a way to avoid paying for my education. My younger sister, who turned 18 a few months ago, is also about to start college. I assumed my parents would follow the same approach with my sister as they did with me. However, a few days ago my sister reached out to me, shocked, to say that our parents had offered to cover all her college expenses. This surprised her because she knew that things hadn't been the same for me. I was equally baffled, as my parents had always insisted they were doing fine, but not well enough financially to support both of us through college. They had emphasized the importance of me becoming self-sufficient, and I had assumed they would take the same stance with my sister. So this sudden turn of events was perplexing. My sister confided that she was just as confused, and had even discussed it with our parents. However, they brushed off her concerns, telling her not to worry about it. She advised me to speak directly to them, and as soon as we hung up, I immediately called my mom. I didn't beat around the bush. I asked straight out why they had offered to pay for all of my sister's college expenses when they had urged me to be independent and cover my own costs. I was pretty upset because I was struggling to balance my work with my studies, and my GPA was suffering. Money was tight, and the situation felt increasingly hopeless. Meanwhile, my parents were offering my sister full financial support, leaving me to handle everything on my own. It felt deeply unfair, and I couldn't help but feel angry. When I confronted my mom, she put me on speaker, and my dad joined the conversation. They started making excuses, saying that they initially believed they couldn't afford to send both of us to college. But now they realized they could manage it, which is why they offered to help my sister, thinking I wouldn't take it personally. But I wasn't buying it. My mom is literally an accountant, so there was no way she wouldn't have known their financial situation. It became clear to me that this was something they had planned, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. After dodging the question for a while, they finally admitted that they chose to pay for my sister's college because they thought she was a better student, and it was a safer investment to make. I was stunned into silence. While I couldn't deny there was some truth to what they said, it was devastating to hear that they didn't think I was worth the investment. Sure, my sister might have been more academically gifted, but I wasn't failing either. I might have been an average student, but it was hurtful to realize they didn't believe I deserved the same opportunities. I don't want to sound entitled, but it felt like they were treating me unfairly, and what stung even more was that they had lied to me. If they had been honest, I might have respected their decision, but instead, they chose to deceive me, making me believe they were trying to help me become independent. In reality, they just wanted to avoid paying for my college education. After my parents shared their reasoning with me, they tried to reassure me that they truly had my best interests at heart. However, they weren't sure if their decisions were truly worth the cost. I couldn't quite grasp their intentions, but it felt as if they were pouring salt into an already painful wound. They explained that they had always assumed my sister would opt for an expensive college due to her stellar academic performance, and they felt they had to be prepared for that possibility. This is why they had encouraged me to work my way through school. They wanted to ensure they could support my sister financially. The only reason they hadn't been upfront with me was because they didn't want to hurt my feelings, but that turned out to be pointless. Now that I knew the truth, my feelings were crushed anyway. If they had just been honest from the start, I might not have felt as wounded as I do now. I didn't express any of this to them. Instead, I abruptly ended the call because their words had drained any desire I had to continue the conversation. Afterward, I texted my sister and shared what I had discovered. She and I are close, so I felt she had a right to know what was happening. She was appalled that our parents would do something like this and told me she wouldn't accept a single cent from them. But I insisted she shouldn't be ridiculous. She deserved their support because she was a bright student and had earned it. I eventually convinced her to let them pay for her tuition and attend the college she wanted. I also made it clear that I wouldn't be keeping in touch with our parents for a while because what they did was deeply hurtful, and I needed some distance. We were supposed to go home for Thanksgiving and Christmas in a couple of weeks, but now I doubted that I would. I didn't say anything further, but it seems my sister mentioned to our parents that I wouldn't be coming home for the holidays. I wasn't sure where I would go, maybe stay with our grandparents for a bit. But one thing was certain. I didn't want to face our parents right now. Unfortunately, my sister telling them this set off a chain of events that made everything even worse. The day after our conversation, my sister contacted me again. She said that after she told our parents I wasn't planning to come home for the holidays, they had gotten into a huge argument. She hadn't meant to overhear, but they were arguing so loudly that it was impossible not to. It turns out that this plan had been mostly our mother's idea. She had somehow convinced our father that I should pay for my own college tuition so they could save money for my sister, just in case she chose to attend college abroad. With her grades and love for travel, it seemed like a realistic option, so my mother wanted to keep all possibilities open for her. This is how she persuaded my father to go along with the plan. Now that I've uncovered the truth and made the decision to cut ties, he's more upset about it than anyone else. He's placing the blame squarely on my mother, accusing her of manipulating him into agreeing with her plan, which ultimately pushed me away. Because of this, I now refuse to come home for the holidays to spend time with them. I'm angry at both of my parents, but it seems unfair for my father to blame my mother entirely when he was just as complicit. My sister told me they've been arguing non-stop, and that my father even threatened to leave my mother if she didn't convince me to come back home. My sister wanted to give me a heads up, so I wouldn't be caught off guard when my mother reached out to me, and I'm glad she did. After hearing this, I took some time to think about everything and realized that their arguments and hurt feelings are not my responsibility. I'm dealing with enough on my own right now and don't need to take on their marital issues too. So I made up my mind. I wasn't going home for the holidays, and nothing my mother said would change that. I was firm in this decision when I answered her call yesterday. No matter what my dad might threaten, their problems are theirs to solve, not mine. Just as they told me I needed to handle my financial troubles on my own and learn to be independent, I decided to let them experience the same. They should deal with their issues independently. It seemed fair enough to me, but after a short conversation, my mother started accusing me of being heartless, insisting I was making a big deal out of nothing. She said I was acting spoiled, as if I was entitled to their money, and that I had no right to feel wronged by their refusal to pay for my college tuition. I found her words deeply hurtful, not because they hadn't paid for my college, but because of the way they treated my sister and me differently, and tried to twist the situation to make it seem like it was somehow in my best interest. If they hadn't gone on about the importance of independence, I could have taken out a student loan and handled things more easily. But I would have needed them as co-signers, which wasn't exactly the independence they preached. My mother, however, justified their actions by saying they treated us differently because our academic performances were vastly different. I found that excuse even more insulting. Vastly different is a strong phrase. I'm not a bad student. I never have been. Yes, my sister has always been a straight A student, and I'm genuinely happy for her. But that doesn't mean I'm incompetent. I've excelled in some areas and struggled in others, like any normal person. But in the field I chose, I've always performed well, and my parents should have recognized that before resorting to such manipulative and downright cruel behavior. My mother and I argued for nearly 15 minutes, but we couldn't reach any resolution. I stood my ground, telling her that I wasn't coming home for the holidays, and that was final. My parents had really messed up, and I had no desire to see them right now. My mother thinks I'm being childish and petty, and she insists that I need to grow up. Meanwhile, I feel like she's being manipulative again. So we're at an impasse. I feel terrible because I don't want to be the cause of their potential divorce, even though I'm not sure if my dad would actually leave her over this. They've had some nasty fights before, but he's never said anything this serious. It's frightening because they've been together since high school, so for him to say he's leaving her is a really big deal. Am I wrong for not wanting to go back home for the holidays after discovering they paid for my sister's college tuition, but refused to do the same for me? Update 1. Thanks for all the comments on my original post. It's been 3 days since I last spoke to my mother, and things have been awkward. I've stayed in touch with my sister, and she keeps telling me not to worry because she knows I'm struggling right now. I've also decided to quit my job, realizing it was the one thing holding me back. For years, I was so engrossed in my job and studies that I lost sight of when it all began to consume me entirely. I found myself with no time left for the things I once loved. It was like I was on autopilot, just going through the motions, and the stress was overwhelming. I can't even remember the last time I went out with my friends. It's been weeks. But this weekend, I finally decided to break the cycle. My friends were genuinely surprised because I've spent most of my time locked in my room, working remotely. But now, I've decided it's time to start living again. I also had a heart-to-heart with my grandparents on my dad's side. After a short talk, they offered to help me out financially if I needed it. With graduation just around the corner, I decided to accept their offer. They'll support me through these last few months. I've got some savings of my own, so I'm not too worried about money anymore. My grandparents also invited me to stay with them during the holidays, which is perfect, because I'm not ready to move back in with my parents. They were just as shocked as I was when they learned the real reason my parents didn't cover my college tuition. My grandpa had even offered to pay, but I turned him down because I was determined to be independent. Looking back, I realize how foolish that decision was. I sacrificed so much in my quest for independence just to please my parents. I was completely naive, and now I regret every bit of it. It's been a week since I last spoke to my mom, and today, after I ignored her texts and calls, she showed up at my college unannounced. I have to admit, I didn't see that coming. Her last few messages insisted that I needed to talk to my dad because he was really upset about everything. She kept saying that both she and my dad loved my sibling and me equally, and they never intended to treat me unfairly. They were just trying to be practical. But that didn't change how I felt. I was furious with both of them and had been avoiding them altogether. When she arrived today, ignoring her wasn't an option. She kept calling, and when I didn't answer, she sent a text saying she had driven all the way here specifically to see me and talk face to face. She wasn't leaving until we talked. I tried to explain to her that I wasn't in the right frame of mind to talk at that moment, but she refused to leave me alone. Eventually, I had no choice but to agree to talk. We decided to go to the nearby Wendy's, where we could speak in private. I didn't want anyone from my college to see us in case things got heated, and since it was already evening, I knew Wendy's would be empty of familiar faces. When we arrived, she insisted on ordering food for me, despite my repeated protests that I wasn't hungry. She said she wanted to make it up to me, and so she got me a bunch of food, and we finally sat down to talk. Or rather, she began explaining herself. She expressed how sorry she was for the way she had treated me, and admitted that there was no justification for her actions. She confessed that she had been trying to rationalize her behavior, both to me and to herself, but she had come to the realization that what she had done was simply wrong. Now, she was there to acknowledge her mistakes and ask for my forgiveness, pleading with me to consider coming back home for the holidays because there was so much we needed to discuss. I told her that I had already spoken to my grandparents, and they had offered to let me stay with them during the holidays. I said I could meet her halfway and might come to stay with them for a couple of days, but no longer, as I really needed some space. She seemed a bit hurt by this, but she accepted it, realizing that it was the best she could hope for at that moment. Then she mentioned that my sister had been accepted into several prestigious colleges, but was refusing to accept any financial help from our parents. That made me feel bad because I knew she was doing it for my sake. I reassured my mother that she didn't need to worry. I would make sure my sister took the money and didn't make any unnecessary sacrifices. I love my sister, and I don't want her to go through the same struggles I did. The truth is, being independent and paying your own way through college isn't as glamorous as it seems. This might sound privileged, but if I'm honest, I would have much preferred having parents who could support me financially until I got a job. Let's not kid ourselves. Those with wealthy parents who are willing to spend thousands on them have it easier. Claiming we're better just because we're independent is a false narrative. Life is easier for them, and that's just a fact, whether people want to admit it or not. Anyway, I assured my mother that I'd ensure my sister accepted their help, because if she tried to balance work and school, she would likely struggle, and I didn't want her grades to suffer as mine had. I couldn't resist asking how things were going between her and my father, since the last I heard, he had been threatening to leave. My mother seemed surprised by the question, but she told me things were going okay. They had decided to go for marriage counseling because they'd been arguing a lot lately, mostly about my situation. To my surprise, my father hadn't reached out to me at all since our last conversation when I found out why they hadn't paid for my tuition. I brought up the issue with my mom, and she explained that my dad had been deeply troubled, wanting to reach out to me multiple times, but he kept doubting himself and couldn't muster the courage to do it. She had urged him to just send me a text and get it over with, but he kept overanalyzing everything, which is why he hadn't been able to reach out to me yet. As my mom recounted this, her eyes welled up with tears, and I felt a deep sense of guilt because my dad is not someone who easily shows emotion. For him to be acting like this, I knew things must be really hard for him. After hearing about his situation, I made a sudden decision. I asked my mom to call him right then. She seemed surprised, but I insisted, telling her I just wanted to talk to him. I wasn't even looking for an apology at that moment. I just missed talking to him. Before our fallout, we used to chat almost every other day. I've always been closer to my dad, so it wasn't shocking that he had tried to defend me this time. I understand that both of them made mistakes, but they're my parents, and I'm ready to forgive them and move forward. This may not be a choice everyone agrees with, but it's mine, and that's what matters. So, my mom called him while we were sitting together, and he picked up immediately. The call wasn't on speaker yet, but the first thing he asked was whether I was okay, which really hit me emotionally. I didn't let my mom respond, and instead, I jumped in, telling him that I was all right and just wanted to talk. I then took the phone from her. He was silent for a moment, and I told him that I was still trying to process everything. I wasn't sure if I had forgiven them yet, but I wanted to work things out. I added that if he kept doubting himself, we'd never be able to have this conversation and sort things out. To my surprise, he broke down and started crying on the phone, apologizing profusely for everything that had happened. I could see my mom trying to hold back her tears across the table, and although I was feeling emotional too, I decided that all three of us couldn't break down at the same time, so I did my best to stay composed as I talked to him. He confided in me that he deeply regretted how everything had unfolded. He never intended to cause me any pain, but both he and my mother realized they had messed up. They were determined to make amends. I explained to him that I needed some time to clear my head and distance myself from them for a while. However, I was open to giving our relationship another chance. He was genuinely appreciative of this, acknowledging that it was a significant step for me. He even expressed his willingness to do whatever it takes to make things right. So, the three of us sat down for a brief conversation about everything that had happened, and we reached the decision that I would stay with them for about 10 days over the holidays. This would give us the opportunity to spend some quality time together as a family. We also agreed to pursue therapy as a group since it was clear we had unresolved issues to address. My parents had already planned to begin marriage counseling, and now all four of us, including my sister, would be participating in family therapy to work through our problems. With the break coming to an end, I'll need to return to college, so we're looking for a therapist who can conduct sessions online. It's essential that we follow through with this because I don't want my family to end up like those who never speak to one another and have no connection. That's the gist of what happened when I met with my mom, and I'm still processing everything we discussed. Despite the overwhelming emotions, I feel more hopeful about the future, and am cautiously optimistic that things will improve. Update 3. Hey everyone. It's been almost a year since my last update. I've finally graduated, and I'm happy to share that I landed a job just a few weeks after finishing school. Now I'm working, and I'm finally free from the stress of studying. I can just focus on my job and come home to relax in my apartment with my roommate. Life feels good, and I could definitely get used to this. I know many of you were curious about how things have been with my parents, especially since some of you were skeptical about my decision to give them another chance. I'm glad to report that therapy has helped us sort things out, and we're in a much better place. Things between us have been positive lately. My grandparents kept their promise and covered my tuition for the last few months, and my sister also accepted our parents' financial support after I explained how difficult it had been for me. As a gesture to make it up to me, my parents have offered to cover my rent for a couple of months until I can save up from my income. I think that's really generous of them, and it's heartwarming to see them making such an effort to set things right. For now, everything is going well, and I honestly have no complaints. Thank you all for checking in and for your continued support.